hair on your head, white as the snow.
President.
Well, it's been expected for a few months, but a lot of people wrote him off a year and a half ago. So he must be feeling somewhat satisfied now. Lots of people said he was too old, too white, and too boring to win the Democratic primary, and he proved them wrong. And he struggled a bit on election day, but I think it's very clear he's going to become president-elect and then president. I think only death can stop him at this point.
Yeah, well, let's hope that doesn't happen, although that's always been one of the considerations, hasn't it, his actual health. And, of course, that brings into play, and you're an expert on these matters, the Vice President, Kamala Harris. What sort of role do you think she'll play in the early days? Let's not speculate yet that she's going to take over halfway through, but what influence will she have on the early days?
I think she'll have some chance of taking over, but I wouldn't assume it's guaranteed by any means. I think she'll have whatever Joe Biden wants to give her, and I think he'll give her a role, probably on projects she wants, but one shouldn't exaggerate how much power she'll have. Like, Joe Biden has been a prominent U.S. political figure since he got elected to the Senate in 1972.
Yes.
He knows everyone. He's got a huge number of long-time aides. He's very different from Mr. Trump, who became President Trump, who became president with virtually no political background. So
and didn't know anybody in Washington. Didn't know a soul in Washington when he arrived, did he?
Not quite, but like on the way there. So I think she'll probably have less internal power than Mike Pence. But obviously, she's now the favourite to be the next Democratic candidate for president. So that will give her a certain aura in itself.
Okay. Now, when people talk about president and vice president, you'd think, oh, this is a very strong team. You know what I mean? Like a football coach and his deputy and something like that. But largely speaking, vice presidents. Who said very famously, being a vice president is like being a bucket of cold spit. I mean, there's nothing in it. So
it was John Garner. I think he used a ruder word than spit. Actually.
He did actually, yeah.
But he'd been Speaker of the House, which is a very powerful role beforehand.
Indeed.
The Vice President has two essential powers. They break a tie in the Senate. So there are two Senate races that are probably still haven't been decided yet.
Yep.
I mean, both in Georgia. If the Democrats win both of those, then Kamala Harris can cast the deciding vote and give them the Senate. Most people think they won't succeed, and I'm dubious they will.
Yeah.
And secondly, if the president dies or is invalidated in some way, they then become acting president or president. And that's obviously very important.
Yes.
But everything else will depend what role the president wants to give her. Joe Biden, one thing I would say is Joe Biden's been vice president himself for 8 years. So he probably has more time for vice presidents than most presidents.
Well, he might, or on the other hand, he might not, because he might carry that resentment from 8 years of being the man in the shadows and now decide, look, it happened to me, it's going to happen to you. Were you surprised, Dr. Packer, at how close the election was? Because once again, just as we saw in this country with an 80-seat majority for Boris Johnson, the pollsters have ignored the silent majority.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's clear that the plurality and probably the majority of people voted for Joe Biden who were voting. And the polls now look like they were maybe a bit less wrong than they looked in election night, but they were wrong a bit. And I think it's actually, in some ways, a bit more like the Brexit referendum. It seems there's a certain kind of socially conservative voter who isn't keen on talking to pollsters. Yep. And they thought they'd adjusted to fully reflect that, and they haven't quite. Yep. And also, there's some signs some non-white voters are swinging right and moving to the Republicans. So I think there's a lot of bad signs for the Democrats for the future, a lot of good signs for the Republicans. But the fact is, whatever he may claim, it's now very clear Mr. Trump has lost and Mr. Biden has won.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. And I don't think President Trump's doing himself any favours by faffing about, talking about legal challenges, making a huge fuss about it. You should retire with dignity.
What he wants to do. If he wants to form his own TV network, a kind of talk radio on steroids to make him very rich, this might be the way to do it. Have a split with lots of Republicans who accept the results, and then people who feel disenfranchised will tune into his TV network. But it depends a bit what he's doing. But I think if he wants to wield political power, this is the wrong way to go about it.
Well, I totally agree. But he's such an extraordinary man. He could do anything he